Thank you very much, Professor Kepel. With your reference to the French Revolution, I'm reminded of the famous quote attributed to Chu Enlai when he was asked of his opinion about the French Revolution. He said, "It's too early to tell." Quite probably, it is too early to tell what will come out of the Arab Spring, but I do fully agree with you that this is a long-term process, a tectonic shift that will have an impact way beyond the Arab world, including the EU. And you just had said a moment ago that these are problems that require resolution on the international level. Susi, is the EU going to resolve anything on the international level? Does the EU have a policy? Is it capable of having one? And how do you assess what it has tried to do so far?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. As Kostek says, I'm not going to try to compete with that incredibly wide-ranging and clear assessment that we've just heard on the developments which are going on in the region. Instead, I'm going to focus my comments on what is going on the European side in terms of policy making and the extent to which that is a process that's going in the right direction or not. And in order to do this, I want to distinguish when I'm talking about Europe's response between what is going on at EU level and what is going on at member state level in the bilateral relationships which European countries have in the region. I think the former is considerably weaker without the latter, as it should be. But conversely, I want to argue that actually, while European policy towards the North African region is constructed as it is, actually the strong ties which a number of member states have in the region can also serve to undermine that collective European response. So I think this is one of the sort of the structural challenges that we face at the moment. Just a little bit of advertising. These are issues which we've looked at in a number of ECFR publications. One of the ones which I'm closely involved with is our foreign policy scorecard, where we try to analyse the trends in the relationships which the EU has with different regions year by year, and to try to track the changes. But it's also a question that we've looked at specifically in relation to North Africa in my colleague Nick Whitney's North Africa Power Audit, which was published last autumn. So I'm going to make brief comments in reference to these publications, but it may be that if you want to explore them further, those might be of interest. So, as you probably know, the main framework of Europe's approach in this region is the European Neighbourhood Policy, which I think does to some extent look quite different to the way it was prior to the Arab Spring. Certainly the budget allocated to it has gone up in recent years, and there has been a lot of thinking going on at European level about the extent to which that policy was properly targeted after the Arab Spring. But what I want to argue this morning is that perhaps the main challenge with that policy as a whole is that it is a collective regional policy when it's dealing with a region which, as Professor Kepel has set out, is undergoing such a variety of different changes which, while linked, are not all necessarily the same. So I wanted to pose that question about whether a regional policy makes sense, or whether foreign policies in each case is a better way to sort of for Europe to consider this region. And I also want to argue that the European neighbourhood policy will always struggle while it is based on a misguided assessment of what Europe's incentives and levers in the North African region are. I want to look specifically at the three main pillars of that, but then to suggest that there are ways in which Europe actually does have more leverage than the pillars of the neighbourhood policy. So the first to use the European jargon, the first of the three pillars of the neighbourhood policy is money, and this was one of the big promises which came after the Arab Spring, that there would be more financial support for the countries in the North African region who were undertaking more political reform. And I think this is an area where there has been a really important debate about what that more for more means, the extent to which it also means less investment for less money. And I think that there have been a number of very creative ways in which, in a continent which is itself undergoing financial crisis, European institutions have managed to create new funds, such as the Spring Fund, the New European Endowment for Democracy, which received significant support from Poland as an idea in its incubation. And so on and so forth. So I don't want to suggest that in this area of European policy towards the North African region there hasn't been creativity and there hasn't been development. I think the problem is one of scale. That while the amounts of money which are invested through European funds in the North African region have increased, these are still very small in comparison with firstly what is received from other countries, notably Gulf countries. I mean, if we take the case of Egypt, I think we can't pretend to be one of the most significant investors there. And I think the other challenge which Europe faces in financial investment in the North African partner countries is the extent to which this is properly tied in with other perceived priorities that we've identified in these countries. And by that I mean, what does it mean to support, say, the Moroccan economy when we have our investment is probably perpetuating sectors which are not necessarily as competitive as they might be. It is not sort of helping to diversify the economy there, and in a sense we're simply through this kind of investment perpetuating existing structures. So I think that the link between economic investment, if you like, and the sort of the broader European agenda is quite a critical issue to look at. The second part of the EU's revised offer after the Arab Spring was trade, was access to markets. Here, I think it's like the French Revolution, far too early to tell what the effect of this is going to be. But the argument ran, and reasonably logically, that if we want to support countries in the North African region in tackling the socio-economic challenges which sparked, in some cases, the unrest which led to transition, then the single biggest thing we could do to help was improving market access. And I think here the negotiations are only just beginning. With Morocco, the groundwork's been cleared. With Tunisia, they're reasonably well advanced. But I think it will take years to see what effect, if any, these changes have under the new neighbourhood policy. But again, I would come back to on this aspect of the neighbourhood policy, this question of one size fits all, and the extent to which this potentially powerful lever is necessarily what all economies need, and the extent to which on the European side we're really willing to consider the sort of market access which could make a difference in this region. And then finally, perhaps the biggest challenge, but perhaps also the biggest prize in the revised neighbourhood policy was mobility. These migration partnerships which are being under consideration. And I think here this is a challenge which goes right to the heart of the political debate which is going on in Europe itself. And I think perhaps here we did overreach ourselves in terms of what we promised. This I think remains a fundamental sticking point in the EU's efforts to reframe its relationship with North Africa, because greater flexibility on migration is not something that can be negotiated without the buy-in of all of the different European member states. This is something where competence is very clearly at a national level, and I think that sort of genuine change on this front, although it is one of the areas which Europe has rightly identified as one of the biggest incentives that it can offer. I think the types of migration partnerships which are under discussion, I believe Morocco is again the most advanced on this front, is really a long way from being of the scale that could make a significant change. So, what would a more strategic approach look like in terms of Europe's engagement with this region? I mean, I think a lot of this is about understanding the developments which are going on in the countries in which we're dealing with, and as I say, trying to ensure that the policies that we're following are as tailored and as sophisticated as they can be within the context of the broader neighbourhood, to deal with the realities of that relationship. And I think that sort of realism about what really matters in each of the relationships with the countries of the region is really crucial too. I mean, what does it mean to have a strong relationship with Algeria, where Algeria has for the first time since the Arab Revolution agreed to come to the table in terms of negotiating an action plan under the neighbourhood policy. But what can that practically mean with a country with whom we have such a strong security and energy relationship? And I think the security component of that relationship is one that has only grown, particularly since events in Mali last year, in terms of the balance of power, if you like, between Algeria and what it can offer to the European side, and Europe and what it can offer back. So is it realistic for us to have a political reform agenda at the same time? I think it is, but sort of working out exactly how we can engage at all levels of that relationship, I think is a complex task. And you know, and I think perhaps even more difficult in those countries which are not in formal transition, where the interlocutors are the same people at governmental level as prior to the Arab Spring, where Europe is trying to sort of reform its engagement, but where the region rather than the country has undergone significant change. And so I think that this sort of very clear assessment, very hard-headed look at where the incentives lie in each of the relationships is a really critical challenge which Europe faces. Perhaps a few words, since I started on the question of security in relation to Algeria. I think this is a critical component, always was, of Europe's relationship with the region, but is not specifically part of neighbourhood policy as such. And there are a range of reasons for this, which go well beyond the region itself. It's about the way that the EU's external action service is set up. It's about the fact that Brussels doesn't really have security resources as such. It's very hard for Europe to respond on any issues as Europe. But I think it's also about sort of the join-up with the new structures in question there. But I think this is a challenge which really feels quite urgent for Europe to sort of to deal with if it does want to have a more meaningful engagement with a lot of these countries, because it's such a cornerstone of the relationship, and without that element, discussions about what currently sits under neighbourhood policy sort of run by the side of what is actually critical in a lot of these relationships. And I think that speaks back to the point that I started with around the EU and its member states. I mean, currently the message from Paris, Rome or Madrid, London or Berlin does hold a lot more clout in North African countries than the message from Brussels does. So I think in this sense, the task which the External Action Service faces and the Commission in taking forward the neighbourhood policy is very daunting in a region which is so central to Europe's strategic energy and security interests, and in which the relationships are played out through the capitals rather than through that regional effort. But I think that really to sort of to change to a more meaningful level of engagement with the region, I think that the partnership does have to be put at a more regional level, and I mean that both ways. I don't mean, of course, that member state ties shouldn't continue, and I think actually in a world where this nuanced understanding of what is going on in the countries which we've spoken of, the long-standing diplomatic ties which are there bilaterally are more crucial than ever. But I think that there needs to be both more investment at a national level in the European voice, and conversely, where member states are acting in a perceived European interest at their own cost, and perhaps the French intervention in Mali was an example here. We need to have better ways at European level to recognise and support what is the European interest, and how the EU effort can get behind that. So I think that's a sort of a broad outline of the way I see the challenges, some of which are new for the EU and North Africa, some of which are actually very old. Some of them are structural, but I think some are actually quite tactical about the way that we engage now. And I think it's absolutely critical for this region, which is so closely tied in with European interests, be they stability, energy, security. But I think that we should always continue to try to improve our engagement there, and continue to try to do better.